So first of all, I want to just add my welcome to those from earlier in the day, from Lauren and from Danielle, to all of you here to the Hartman Institute. I hope it has been a productive and difficult day so far. And in that spirit, anti-Semitism. I'm really excited and honored to be opening this program tonight in conversation with Professor Deborah Lipstadt. And I'll say what I said to the lay leaders when you were with them a week ago. You know, there are very few great Jewish historians. There are very few of the great Jewish historians who actually play a role in Jewish history, and there are extremely few, maybe just one, who are heroes of Jewish history. And I want to just thank you and congratulate you for all of your work that you've done in this arena. Tonight, in the context of our 10-day exploration about questions of nationalism, tribalism, global identity, we want to explore the questions of anti-Semitism, which are either on the rise, or if they never went away, are at least in a different way today than even 2 years ago, part of our cultural conversation because of the visible ways in which these trends are emerging in America, in Europe, and in many other parts of the world. And this is all, we're here with you in light of the publication of your new book, Antisemitism Here and Now. It's for sale here afterwards, and it's for sale in other places in Jerusalem. And as you just mentioned to me, in its fourth printing, so a lot of people want to read about this topic, and I guess for better or worse. I want to start by asking you, and to explore some of these topics tonight. One of the things that's easy to notice as you read the book is the book is set as a series of letters between you and what I imagine is a composite of a student and a composite of a professor. And it is situated, as a result, on a college campus. I know that's partly because that's where you live and work, on a college campus. But I wanted to start by asking you why the context of the campus is where you choose to launch this conversation. What is it about the unique conditions of the college campus that may make it ripe for certain expressions of anti-Semitism? And what do we need to understand about campus life as we open up this conversation on confronting anti-Semitism?
Well, first of all, it is where I live. So it's what I know. And it's where the two characters with whom I have this exchange of letters are composites. They're not real people, though I have had many people come to me and said, "Oh, you based it on me." So I say, "Yep, buy another book," and you know. So, but they're composites. They're not real characters. But everything that comes out of their mouths, everything they ask me, really, I've been asked. I've been asked by students. I've been asked by colleagues. And I've been asked off campus, too, because some of the things I situate off of campus. So first and foremost, it's what I know best. But second of all, I think for better or for worse, certainly in the United States, the college campus is a breeding ground, both good and bad, for ideas, for notions, for movements, whether we look back on Vietnam, whether we look at the anti-apartheid movement, the Green movement. Things get started there. They become part of the conversation. Sometimes they just stay within the campus. Sometimes they move outside of it. A. B, the campus, you know, and I consider myself a liberal, and I don't apologize for it, but the camp...
Mild applause for liberalism.
We are a dying breed, let me tell you. But the campus also, for being the home of a lot of smart people, a lot of stupid things can happen, you know, and we know that. And I think that sometimes there's a dogmatism and a simplification of ideas that we see expressed on the campus that will move off of it. And in terms of certainly, not just in terms of attitudes towards Israel and not just in terms of anti-Semitism, I also see evolving on the campus what I call a McCarthyism of the left, which bothers me very deeply, that there's sort of an expectation that you will be a certain way or have a certain Weltanschauung, a certain worldview. And sometimes that breeds or is a place where anti-Semitism can find a comfortable home to breed.
So let's go back to maybe a first principles question. 5 years ago, I'm not sure we would have had an evening program here at the Institute in Jerusalem talking about anti-Semitism. I want to explore that a little bit later on what it means when, what it means to confront anti-Semitism when trying to also build a positive Judaism. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But it does seem it is now a conversation in the Jewish world and the larger world that's unavoidable. And it feels as though we have been hurdled into something that we spent a long time trying to say it was going away or it wasn't bothering us that much. So what has changed in the past 24 months that this conversation on anti-Semitism has become so front and center?
I think it's more than 24 months. I think it's been evolving over quite a while. When I started to write this book, I wrote the genesis of the book was after the Gaza war. I wrote an op-ed that was in the New York Times, saying that anti-Semitism is real. We're seeing an uptick of it, and it's not just related to Gaza. It preceded it, and it exists separate to attitudes towards Israel. At that point, my literary agent, called me because the article got, I don't know how many retweets and resends and emailed, etc. He said, "So where's the book proposal?" So I said, "What book?" He said, "Deborah, look at the reaction to the article. I'm sure. I thought for sure this was part of a book proposal." I said, "No, I don't want to be stuck in the sewers of anti-Semitism. Bad enough I have to deal with Holocaust deniers, And he said, no, you have to write it. Well, he's a real nudge. So I wrote a proposal, and he sold it, so I had to write the book, But speaking more seriously, as I was writing it, and I wrote it over the past, I would say, I started in 2015, summer, because I had other book things that and commitments that I had to finish. And at times I would say, maybe by the time I finish this, it'll be quieter. It'll quiet down. And I found it to be a very hard book to write, and I couldn't figure out why. I've written, books on Holocaust denial. I've written on my trial. I've written on a variety, on the Holocaust, of course. And it suddenly dawned on me that in the other books, even when I was writing about my trial, I was writing about what was, in terms of anti-Semitism, in terms of the Holocaust, arguments about the Holocaust, attacks on the Holocaust. But here I was writing about what is. And that became, dealing with the current, the here and now, was a challenge. But if it was a hard book to write, it was a harder book to finish. Because as I began to finish it just 10 months ago, it seemed that every day there'd be something else happening. And when I got back the galleys, and I know there are many authors in this room, and it's sort of an unwritten notion that when you get back your galleys, your edited galleys, you can make a few changes, but you're not going to make extensive changes. It used to be you couldn't because things would be typeset. Now with digital, it's a little easier. But as I began to read through the book, I saw that I had to add stuff. It was last summer, Israel's agreement with Poland that now everything was fine and dandy regarding the Polish Holocaust law. A woman, a Holocaust survivor in Paris, being killed in her apartment. Word coming out on Jeremy Corbyn's going to the burial or memorial place of the Munich massacres. Every day there seemed to be something. So I called my editor and I said, look, I'm going to add stuff. And of course it means that the cover's already printed, so if you're going to add a lot, they have to adjust it, and there was all sorts of technical things. But she got it, and she said, okay. Finally, about, September 10th or so of last year, she called me. She said, Deborah, look, it's in the catalog, and we've got to have it by Monday if you don't, because otherwise it won't be there to sell, etc. So I said, no problem. And Sunday night, before I hit send, I added the following paragraph, and I just looked back. It was about September 12th, September 15th, that I'm a historian and I avoid prophecy. Because what does the Talmud say after the completion of the Tanakh, prophecy is left for children and fools? I don't consider myself either one. So I said, but here, and usually historians, as you well know, historians who make predictions generally are wrong, and their only saving grace is people forgot what they predicted. But here I said, I wrote, this is the last paragraph I wrote, because you write the introduction last, in the end of the introduction, I said, I'm willing to predict by the time this book appears, something will have happened that should have been included. And 6 weeks later came Pittsburgh. So it surprised, Pittsburgh didn't surprise me, but it shocked me. But, I've been surprised. I have been surprised by the steady uptick.
So what do you think's going on? I mean, what are the geopolitical trends? And part of what you're trying to argue in your book is of the persistence, recurrence, the metastasis that anti-Semitism expresses, but it still requires us to locate what are the conditions now that seem to be such a powerful, different breeding ground for anti-Semitism wherever it happens to be located.
I compare anti-Semitism, and I say this in all due seriousness because I know it's a serious disease. You say metastasize. I compare it to a herpes virus. If you know anyone who's had a herpes virus, if you get the herpes virus, I think now there may be some medications that cure it. But by and large, you have it, you're stuck with it, and it lies dormant in your body, and it emerges under two conditions. One of stress, and one of a hospitable atmosphere. So if you're under stress, you're going for a job interview, the day before your wedding, suddenly you get a sore and you get an outbreak of herpes. Or hospitable conditions, you have a sore, an infection someplace, and the virus migrates to that place. I would say that is evocative of anti-Semitism. There's been a lot of societal stress. And I don't mean by that, where we suggest that people have lost jobs, therefore we're only talking about people at one end of the economic ladder. I think it goes much more beyond that. But changes, globalization, changes in societal structure, acceptance of things which once might have seemed impossible to accept. I think in the United States, we began to see right-wing, far right-wing groups emerge with the election of President Obama, having nothing to do with his policies, but with the idea of a black man and a black family in the White House, which upset a lot of people. I think that there's been a pushback against globalization, whether it's populism, whether it's nationalism, whatever you want to call it, it's not necessarily anti-Semitic, but it often creates the conditions for intolerance, which comes with anti-Semitism. And finally, I think you can't ignore the immigration, the tremendous wave of migration, which doesn't necessarily give rise to anti-Semitism. In certain cases, it even gives rise to philo-Semitism, because the assumption is that Jews are against Muslims who are part of this great migration. But I think it gives rise to a certain intolerance, which again is a place that anti-Semitism finds its home.
The struggle I have with the metaphor to a virus is I guess there's a few pieces to it. One is, on one hand, intellectually it's kind of liberating. This is not something that was created in a particular moment. The biologification of the story is that it's something that endures. It also suggests that that there's something almost inexplicable about it. And at the same time, what's terrifying about it is then it doesn't seem to lend itself to any sort of cures or solutions, that the best you're going to ever be able to do at any given time is to suppress the symptoms, but not necessarily change it. So what happens when we make anti-Semitism into something that can never actually... Who becomes responsible for defeating it? What become the strategies to suppress it if it's something that actually transcends our ability to really deal with it?
In the best of all possible worlds, study of rape would not be conducted in women's studies department, but if there were such a thing, there'd be a men's studies department. Courses on the Holocaust wouldn't be given in Jewish studies department, but if there were such a thing, in Christian studies department or in European history departments. But it's always the victim who looks at these things, because it's their ox who's being gored, it's their lives that are on the line. But to be, absolutely depressing, but honest, I'm not sure you can cure anti-Semitism. I think that doesn't mean you can't do things about it. That doesn't mean you can't address it. But I think it is so deeply embedded in the culture and in the weeds, in the roots of society, and has metamorphized in so many different ways. I just read an article by Alan Johnson, a professor in England, on Labour Party anti-Semitism. Very, very good article in Fathom magazine. It's an online magazine. And he had a great analogy there where he talked about anti-Semitism as a piano on which different tunes are played. And he talked about it as shape-shifting. So it can start out in the Middle Ages as something of medieval, church theology. It can move to a Voltaire who's an enemy of the church, but who writes about anti-Semitism in a way that it could come out of a medieval church preacher. It moves from there to the pseudoscience of eugenics. It moves from there to a Karl Marx. It moves from there to the Nazis. It changes, and it has become, I think it was Robert Wisberg, who taught at the Hebrew University, who passed away a number of years ago, who coined the term the oldest hatred, or the longest hatred. It has, over so many years, been used by people to explain the world that they're seeing. And because it has this ancient history and these stereotypes that are so deeply embedded, it makes sense to someone. If there's the joke that was supposedly told by Jews in Nazi Germany in the 30s of a Nazi official who comes to a meeting, he says, and the Jews are our misfortune, and they did this, and the Jews did that, and the Jews did that, and someone yells out, and the bicycle riders, and the first people, he says, why the bicycle riders? And the person says, why the Jews? But it's so in the weeds, it's so in the roots, that it makes sense to people. When you say, I was saying this to a group of the rabbis, I think yesterday, that there are people who, when you use the term who will use the term to Jew someone down, and honestly not realize that it's an anti-Semitic term, because they're just used to hearing it. So I'm not sure that something like that can be eliminated, can be cured, just like I'm not sure racism can be cured or eliminated. It's not as old, but still it has its roots. I think what you can do is, A, take it seriously, B, understand what it is, C, figure out how to respond and how to expose people or make people aware of that they're engaging in it. I'm not saying you sit idly by, but I am saying that the thought that we can solve the problem, I'm not sure is the case.
So you allude to a comparison to racism, and in your comments just now, there's one is older and one is newer. I felt this struggle throughout the book of trying to, on one hand, acknowledge that anti-Semitism is of a family of hatreds, with racism, with Islamophobia, with transphobia, with a whole series of other hatreds, and at the same time an attempt to come up with some differentiation. And I want to try to sharpen that if we can. What is similar and what is different? And I guess partly what's bothering me in this is, in the American Jewish experience, and this is not going to be true other places in the world necessarily, it may be true that anti-Semitism is older, runs deeper, whatever it may be, but it also may be that structural racism against African Americans is actually a much worse gripping social problem for Americans than anti-Semitism, and I worry whether our foregrounding anti-Semitism as being older and unique and different than all these other hatreds actually disincentivizes Jews from getting involved in that work because of, well, I got to prioritize looking out for my own. So how do we, on one hand, think about anti-Semitism being different than these other hatreds, but not let it become an obstacle for moral activism?
It's a great question. First of all, I think you can't be against one ism without being against all isms. You can't. You're going to fight harder against the ism which affects you directly. But I think to be selective and say I don't care also. Not only forgetting the moral component on a strategic component is, how can you say to someone, well, I don't care if you get beaten up, but if my kid gets beaten up, that's the only thing I care about. I'll care more about my kid, but So I think that that's important. But in the book, I tell the anecdote, which actually did happen, of arriving at someone's home. I think it was in the summer, so Shabbat was quite late, and people arrived in dribs and drabs, and we were standing around in the kitchen just chatting, etc., a whole bunch of people. And in the room, there was a mother who was berating her son for having come home very late from a party the night before, a high school kid. He'd gone to one of the local universities and been there, and she had been very worried. He had turned off his phone, et cetera, et cetera. And he said to her, and I was, of course, busily eavesdropping, and so sorry I couldn't take notes, but I remembered very hard.
We call that research.
Yes, yeah. Right. He said, Ma, you don't get it. First of all, four of the guys left the party together. When we walked out of the house where the party was being held, there was a policeman driving by, and he drove very slowly, and he followed us as we walked to the car. And then when we got into the car, he followed us as we drove out of the neighborhood till we were on the highway and could drive away. So we felt very protected. And all I could think was that if I had been with a group of my African-American friends or colleagues, that would not have been reassuring. You know, so of course it's quite different. And at least in the United States, African Americans face prejudice and face discrimination in a very different kind of way. But having said that, well, let me add one other point. There's a similarity between racism and anti-Semitism and something strikingly different. And I think understanding anti-Semitism calls for understanding the difference. The racist looks at the black person, the brown person, sometimes the Asian person, the Muslim, but certainly someone whose color is different, and says, if that person moves into our neighborhood, if that person sends their kids to my school, or whatever it might be, they will bring down the school. They will bring down the value of real estate because they are lesser than. Think back to 1936 in the Berlin Olympics. How did the Nazi leadership explain to so-called Aryans, a made-up concept, but of non-Jewish Germans, you know, who weren't Jews, purebred in their concept, purebred, that Jesse Owens was able to win 4 Olympic medals. You know, how did they explain his great athletic feat? And as I like to say, you can spell feet either way, and you'll be right. You know, and so what did they say in the Nazi newspapers? All the newspapers were controlled by the government, but in the main newspaper it said, Jesse Owens is a black man from Africa, and as a black man from Africa, his physical makeup is closer to an animal than it is to a human being, and he has a hip structure that is reminiscent of a horse, and therefore no Aryan running as fast as he could ever beat that. So it's that punching down. A racist punches down. The anti-Semite, who is generally the same person as the racist, we shouldn't think that they're two different people, the anti-Semite looks at the Jew and says, this Jew is all powerful. This Jew is financially powerful. This Jew has intellect, used nefariously, used maliciously. This Jew has power, which they don't care about whom it hurts, as long as it helps them. But, and again, building on Christian theology, which has morphed and been adopted, this Jew is like the demon. And what is it about the demon? The demon can shape himself, can disguise himself in any form so that you don't know you've been harmed by the demon till after the demon is gone. So the anti-Semite punches up. What's unique about anti-Semitism is that conspiracy element. You don't have it with racism. You don't have it with fear of Muslims or fear of gays or whatever it might be. But the conspiracy thing, that is unique to anti-Semitism. I think to your question of, can you address one without the other? No, as I said earlier, no, I don't think you can. I think we have to, we as Jews are certainly terribly concerned about this. The challenge, and I I may have mentioned this to you, but since the publication of the book, after the movie on the trial, etc., many of my speaking invitations were coming to address people come from non-Jewish venues. I'm going to be in Sydney speaking at the Opera House, at the Melbourne Literary Festival, not just at Jewish venues. In those venues, what I stress is, Jews don't look like victims. We don't present as people often imagine victims to present. We're white in their eyes, not in the far right's eyes, but in most people's eyes, we're white. We're privileged, or so it appears, even though there are many Jews who are not privileged, and that doesn't look like a victim. But I think that's where anti-Semitism is different, and it's scary. It's scary. I mean, there's still people on the face of the earth who were alive when 1 out of every 3 Jews were murdered, and most of those Jews they weren't all privileged, but it started in a place where Jews were very comfortable, where many Jews were privileged, and where Jews felt themselves very much integrated. So the challenge is to get the people who are not familiar with anti-Semitism to take it seriously, because they look at us and they say, what are they complaining about? The challenge is to say to Jews, yes, this is something serious. Yes, we should be worried about it, but we also have to understand that it presents to us in a way that is often less frightening, less overtly dangerous than it might present to another group.
So the other equivocation that I felt throughout the book that I struggled with as well is on quote-unquote anti-Semitism on the right versus anti-Semitism on the left. So putting in context the larger cultural shift that's taken place in America, where partisan ideology is the strongest, partisan identity is the strongest ideological predictor of difference. And that's changed over the past 25 years. But now your partisan affiliation is a stronger predictor of your ideological difference from people on the other side of the political party than is race, age, gender, socioeconomic class, geography, etc. Partisanship is essentially an American religion. One of the things that happens as a result is, in a partisan climate, anti-Semitism is in a contest, right? If I can categorize the other political party as anti-Semitic, not only what I do is I seize moral suasion to my party. We don't house anti-Semites, and I can leverage anti-Semitism as being politically instrumental, politically useful. And so it was hard, even as I'm trying to be dispassionate about this and read this, to say, well, why are these really the same? Is BDS on campus, as you devote a couple of chapters to, really the same as white nationalism in America? Doesn't white nationalism actually threaten people's lives in America in ways that are different than the BDS movement? So I guess I want you to reflect on both a climate in which anti-Semitism appears in both sites, and what it means to try to both take that seriously while allowing that people are going to want one of these to be worse than the other because it serves their political interests.
Well, what I've written about, I write about in the book, and what I've written since the book came out is my distress at the weaponization, the political weaponization, which is what you're describing, of anti-Semitism. I have friends who are solidly on the left who never noticed anti-Semitism until the last presidential campaign and in months since the election of Donald Trump. And I have friends on the right who don't notice anything, but they see it very clearly on the left. Both are seeing something that's really there, but they're seeing it, with an eye patch on to the other side. The anti-Semitism itself is the same. The tropes are the same. The stereotypes are the same. Money, power, intellect used nefariously, as I said, and the conspiracy theory. Just a few weeks ago, I believe it was in Detroit, there was a dyke march, a lesbian march, and the Jewish members who wanted to march of the organization were told they couldn't march with the Israeli flag. Some of them wanted to take the Israeli flag. Some of them wanted to take a gay flag with a Magen David on it. So they were standing on the side, and a bunch of neo-Nazis had come to protest the Dyke March, but when they saw the Israeli flag, some of them urinated on the Israeli flag. And so it was right meeting left, you know. David Irving, my buddy, so to speak, you know, recently gave an interview in which he said that he's very impressed with Jeremy Corbyn. Now, Jeremy Corbyn is a man of the far left. David Irving is a man of the far right. There's nothing they agree on in policies except one thing, anti-Semitism. So it's the same motifs. It's the same approach. Maybe it looks a little bit Jews-controlled. The media, I can't, you know, someone on the left, I think it was Michelle Goldberg, who had an article, a columnist for the Times, had an article last winter where she talked about, you know, I'm going to speak out bravely about problems with Israel because you have to be brave to criticize, which is ludicrous. You get criticism, you know, all the time, certainly in the New York Times and other newspapers as well. But it's the same trope, it's the same stereotype, it's the same memes, it's not different. But I think the hardest thing we have is to look at next to us, not across the political transom, but people sitting right next to us and criticize them and say, this is something that has found a place in my home, in the political arena where I find myself. And it's very, very difficult, and I think it's going to be difficult for Jews. Now, yes, we've seen more violence on the right, but we see an institutional, Pittsburgh, Poway, various arrests where things haven't happened. But we see on the left is an institutionalization of anti-Semitism, which can become very dangerous as well. So I don't think it's a contest which is worse. And when you get into the contest of which is worse, forget it. It's not going to lead to anything productive.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the use of the Shoah, the use of the Holocaust, especially because it's become such recent news. And you say in the book, as if anticipating the American conversation right now about the detention camps on the border, you say you eschew comparisons to the Holocaust, especially when you talk about European anti-Semitism today, because as you say, most anti-Semitism in Europe is not state-sponsored. It's actually viewed as an enemy of the state. And I think many of us are wondering what was the point of the culture of never again, as it has been deployed as a moral voice in order to do something beyond prevent the specific experience of what happened to the Jews in Europe from happening again. I guess the Holocaust Museum is the weirdest case. The Holocaust Museum coming out publicly to criticize a member of Congress for making an analogy between the detention camps and concentration camps, when the whole reason why you can get congressional approval for a Holocaust museum on federal property is because it was actually supposed to be a museum about American interventionism. So if that's the case, the whole premise of the museum is about making comparisons and trying to prevent cultural takeovers of fascism and the consequences that they have for civilians. So what do we do with that?
I'm a great fan of the Holocaust Museum. I'm going to spend my next academic year there. Maybe not after the statement I'm about to make, but no, I doubt that. I'm a great fan. I think it is a top-notch place. The research, it's generally very careful when it says things. So I don't know the backstory on this statement because it was issued just as I was leaving the States, and I haven't been in contact with my friends there. I think it was a mistake. Because, first of all, things are comparable. I think the Shoah has unique elements. I think it has absolutely unique elements. I can think of no other example of a state going after people, not just inside its borders, but outside its borders, outside its continent, Rhodes, Libya, Corfu, of any people, irrespective of age, irrespective of ability to do harm to the state, etc. That we don't have any other examples of that. But there are things that are similar, and I saw this quite a few years ago. I was in Cape Town, and I visited what was then their small Holocaust memorial. Since then, they've built a museum. And as part of the exhibit, there were two pictures side by side. One of a pretty well-known picture of a German doctor in a white coat with a caliper measuring a little girl's nose. And behind him was a chart of noses. These are Jewish noses, these are pure Aryan noses, these are African noses, whatever. So and then standing next to him was next to that picture, hanging next to that picture, was a picture of a little girl, dark-skinned, but not terribly dark-skinned, standing on a chair, and next to her was someone, I don't remember if he was also in a white coat or not, and she had a pencil through her hair. And if any of you are South Africans, you know about the pencil test. The pencil test was that you put a pencil through someone's hair. If the pencil fell out, they were white. If the pencil stayed in, they were colored. And there were instances in South Africa of families, children being separated from families because they happened to have a darker skin shade, and they did the pencil test and it stayed in. And I think what the museum was saying is that though in the aftermath, apartheid did not turn into a Holocaust because the white South Africans needed the black South Africans to make them rich and to mine the gold and the diamonds and wash their babies and clean their houses, et cetera, et cetera. But there are things that are similar. And I think to say nothing can be compared leaves you as an academic, as a researcher, as a scholar, stymied. I think the use of, and this is one representative who tweeted, the concentration camps, and then she said never again. So that was the link to the Holocaust. I think something can be horrible. I wrote this already a year ago in The Atlantic. Something can be horrible. Something can be absolutely unacceptable, as I think the separation of children is, as I think the treatment of children in those camps, they don't have enough food. In the richest country in the world, we throw away more food than would be needed to feed all the hungry, plus the kids in the camps. Babies are being taken care of by little. It's too terrible to fathom. It's too terrible to imagine. And any American who doesn't lose sleep over this, something's really wrong. But is it a Holocaust? Is it a genocide? I don't think so. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It's not wrong. And it doesn't mean you should say, oh, when it's a genocide, wake me when it's a genocide. But glib comparisons don't work. And the irony, of course, with the Shoah, because my earliest work was on American responses, especially in the pre-Shoah period in the 30s, that the time to stop a Shoah, the time to stop a genocide is before it happens. So if you say, well, it's not as bad, then, and finally, the reason I don't like these comparisons is because the whole conversation now has been about, is it a Shoah? Is it like a Shoah? Forget that. It's horrible. The conversation amongst Americans should be, what can we do to stop this?
But memory has moral suasion. That's what we do as the Jewish people. We take an experience of a particular moment and we ask, as Jonathan Safran Foer writes in his Everything is Illuminated, the Jew looks at an event and says, what does it remember like? That's what we do. We narrate stories where we know they're not the same. I know that Amalek's recurrence throughout history doesn't mean that they're actually the same people. It's because when I tell a powerful story that's rooted in the past, it animates a sense of belonging. So I know all the strategic reasons you're saying not to do it, but isn't that what we're kind of supposed to do with Jewish memory?
I think you can do it in a way without drawing on the comparisons, and I think that's what we've seen a lot of. Michael Hayden, who was in the Bush administration last year when the separation of children started, and that's what prompted my article in The Atlantic, tweeted a picture of the gates of Birkenau. This is coming from someone, a Republican, and I just said, no, don't do that. Don't go there. Of course we use history, and of course we use comparisons, and we're always looking at in that way. But I think that sometimes it goes beyond.
And what about when the Prime Minister today describes Iran as, and for the past 20 years, there's no Jewish leader in Jewish history who has used more Holocaust analogies than the current Prime Minister of Israel. So is there a difference between his claim that Iran is Germany, it's 1938 and Iran is Germany, versus the use of this in American political discourse around American policy?
Well, I don't know how many of you have seen my interview today in the Times of Israel. I gave it over-caffeinated and underslept, so the filters were down. But
More of that. That's good. That's
yeah,
good.
right. No, I got to fly out tomorrow morning. I got to get sleep tonight. But I think sometimes we cheapen things, and what happens again, setting aside the historical and the intellectual and a context, if we chicken little, dear me, the sky is falling, or tafasta merubella, tafasta, if you try to grab too much, you don't grab anything at all. If you keep using these analogies, people become inured to them. Oh, there they go again. And also, I think out of respect to the people who endured this. I mean, I use that flipping it when people say, genocide of the Palestinians or the Nazi-like tactics of the IDF, I go ballistic. I said, first of all, you can disagree totally with Israel's policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians, with the IDF's policy. You can go there, you can do that. I don't, but you can do that. But it's not a genocide. It's not a Holocaust. And you're overstating what you may be disagreeing with the IDF about doing, and you're overstating what the people who you see as being persecuted are suffering. I think you have to be careful with those things. I think it cheapens it. Iran can be a real threat without it being 1938. And then you have the flip side. I have stood in Birkenau. I went on the March of the Living once and listened to a representative of the Israeli government, who happens now to be the prime minister. He wasn't then. And there wasn't a flyover, but he said if there had been a state of Israel, we would have sent our Air Force and we would have ended it. And as a historian, sometimes when you know historical detail, it complicates life. And I'm thinking, now, where would they have taken off from? Where would they have refueled? What would they have bombed? It's not so simple. And when you make it so simple, you diminish the seriousness of the problem. You turn it into a slogan. And this is too serious a problem to be sloganized.
I guess I'm just part of what troubles me about this in this current moment is there does seem to be I agree with you on both fronts. I'm happy for the comparisons not to be in either place, but there does seem to be an outraged double standard against a congresswoman who's a woman of color using this turn of phrase and the amount of vitriol that comes from Jewish institutions of you can't do that versus the amount of vitriol that comes to people who are seen as the political right and using the Holocaust to talk about, quote unquote, preserving Jews.
I agree with you. And I think that this situation that we now face calls for us, Chachamim hizaru b'divreichem, wise people, thoughtful people, be careful with what you say. I think it calls for us to be very, very thoughtful. It's a serious situation, and you don't want to give people who want to diminish it or want to ignore it the ammunition for doing it. And I've heard, I've sat at too many Shabbos lunches where this is what they should do. They should just bomb them. They should just, or whatever it might be. Or why don't those Jews of France all leave? Or people will say, and the other thing that drives me crazy, why didn't the German Jews leave? Well, first of all, I hate that question because in 1933 there were 580,000 German Jews in Germany, and in 1939 there were 300,000. So close to 300,000 did leave. They left to very safe places. They left to places like Amsterdam and Paris and Brussels. And who would have thought, that if you just went across the channel, you were safer? No one knew that. And it also suggests, when people ask that, is, I would have left. I'm smarter. Or I was recently in Lodz. I was in Lodz last week, and I was walking with someone, a nice guy, but he just said, well, how come they didn't rise up? And, I held back because I liked them. But it was hard. It was hard. But it was that sense of if I had been there, I would have done that. And the Holocaust victims deserve better than that.
Let me ask you one more question, then I'll open up to the crowd for I'm sure many other questions. Yeah. One of the things that kind of lingers in the back of my mind is if you're actually scared about anti-Semitism, being really loud about it might be backwards. Like if you're genuinely scared about the rise of anti-Semitism in your society, organize quietly and pack. And there's something weird about the volume of anti-Semitism, and it relates to something that you write about in the book, which is we have to figure out how to fight anti-Semitism and how to defeat anti-Semitism without amplifying anti-Semitism. And I'm curious how to do that, and I'm also curious, especially because you talk about this in the section on BDS, how does the Jewish community in particular fight what you consider to be a dangerous and anti-Semitic discourse without, number one, amplifying it, and number two, without controlling speech? Because that winds up fighting what you consider to be hate speech might require doing things that actually damage the very conditions that American Jews have thrived in.
Right. No, I don't have an easy answer for it. I just call them as I see them. I didn't say I was solving all of them. But no, it is a very serious problem. It is a very serious problem. I have told people at one point, before he sued me, David Irving showed up in Atlanta and was giving a speech in the courthouse steps of Decatur, those of you who know the area. And a couple of my students said, we're organizing and we're going down to yell and scream. And I said, don't. I don't think anybody's going to be there except the media. And if you show up and yell and scream, he'll get airtime. If you don't show up, he doesn't have the oxygen. And they said to me, but it feels so good to do it. And I said, this is too serious an issue to do what feels good. So I think sometimes, there's a time to be quiet and there's a time to speak. There's a time to react strongly and there's a time, sometimes we react very strongly on small things and and it's a judgment call. It's a judgment call. But I think this is a war. And it's got to be fought wisely. And it's got to be fought strategically. And it's got to be thought thoughtfully. It's very easy to meet the young person, that person, that kid on campus, Jew, non-Jew, whatever, joined BDS, says, anti-Semit. Not every kid, or even faculty member, but certainly student, who joins BDS is necessarily an anti-Semite. BDS itself, if you look at the founding documents of the BDS movement or organization, is anti-Semitic. There's no question. It calls for the end of the state of Israel, calls for, there's no question, to my mind, that's unequivocally anti-Semitism. But I think there are lots of kids who join BDS thinking, much as my generation thought vis-a-vis apartheid, well, this is a way of getting a country to change a human rights policy that violates others. And if you say to that kid, that's anti-Semitic, then the kid looks at you like you're crazy. Or I'll give you another example. You can say in many quarters in the Jewish community, J Street, and they say, anti-Semites. Now, you may not agree with J Street's left-wing policies, but to declare them anti-Semitism, all you're doing is pushing the group to the far, out of the reaches of the community. That doesn't mean that some of these new groups, Jewish Voices, so-called Jewish Voices for Peace or whatever, I think some of them do engage in anti-Semitism. Jeff Salkin is here someplace, and he just wrote about this, having attended one of their meetings. It's anti-Semitic tropes, it's anti-Semitic depictions of Israel. There's no question about it. But we've got to use a scalpel and not an axe in differentiating it. Not because it's not serious, but because it is so serious.
Okay, let me take a couple of, I'll take them in bunches if that's okay. We'll take three, and then go ahead, Rory.
So I just wanted to ask, in terms of what you're saying of anti-Semitism being unique because of the conspiracy theories, it seems like more and more some of the language that I'm hearing in Islamophobia also seems to be engaging in these, creeping Sharia law and the sense of refugees coming in to secretly undermine governments and things like that. And so I wonder how that connects with the definitions that you've laid out.
First of all, I don't use the term Islamophobia. I use fear of Muslims because I think there's a difference there. But in any case, that's for another conversation. I think there is a difference. First of all, the kid in the yarmulke, the woman in the hijab, the whatever and whatever symbol should feel as secure and as safe walking down the street. And if you aren't disturbed, if you see, if you're disturbed by the kid in the yarmulke or the person in the yarmulke being harassed, and you're not disturbed by a woman in the hijab being harassed, then on a strategic level you're absolutely short-sighted, and on a moral level you're failing. So, but I think it's not a conspiracy theory so much. Because I'll give you an example. In Charlottesville, what were those marchers chanting? Replace us. The Jews will not replace us. What did they mean by that? And I think from a strategic point of view, they probably think that was the biggest mistake because they exposed who they were. If you noticed, if you go back and look at the videos of them, they look like they came out of a J. Crew catalog. They were told, they were specifically told by the organization, the alt-right, not nice people, to come in, not to come in any paraphernalia or T-shirts or anything that, or with swastikas or anything that would, to come in khakis and polo shirts, et cetera, et cetera. But what did they mean by Jews will not replace us? They are convinced, it goes back to my punching up, punching down. They are convinced that there is a white Christian genocide going on. The far right is convinced that there's a white Christian genocide. And they point to the influx of people from Africa. They would use words much more provocative than influx, and of Muslims into Europe, into Western societies. But they do not believe that people of color, Muslims, etc., are smart enough to be engineering this white Christian genocide. They are the pawns in it. But if you want to look at who is controlling it, who's the puppet master, it's a George Soros, it's a Rothschild, it's Jews. And if I spend a lot of time poking around their websites for my sins, and one of the cartoons I recently saw was of a two-headed monster-like dog, and the one head had a black face and one had a face in I don't know whether it was a keffiyeh or something that indicated it was a Muslim, and riding on the back of the dog, holding the sort of reins, controlling this animal, was someone. In one version, it was someone with peyot and with a payas and a beard, and in another version, it was a George Soros. So in other words, the Jew is controlling the Jew. And the guy who came to Pittsburgh, what was he so upset about? I mean, he was upset about many things. So crazy and, and evil. But that synagogue had a weekend support, a Shabbaton supporting Hayas, which helps refugees. So that's where I see the conspiracy theory that yes, the Sharia law and all that, you could say that is a conspiracy, certainly. But when I talk about conspiracy, it's this conspiracy against us that we can't quite put our finger on it. We can't quite find out who's doing it. And there was another, and I just posted it I think yesterday, another cartoon. By a cartoonist who's now been invited to a conference at the White House, so some of you may have seen it, with George Soros as the puppet master. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, let me take these two comments right here.
All right, you can
take two other comments.
Earlier this evening, you mentioned fighting an ism, if I heard you correctly, and we should fight all isms. And the term that came to my mind immediately was intersectionality. And I was hoping maybe you could share a few words with us. What is going on with the social justice movements but they seem to be blind to targeting anti-Semites, and yet they'll support anti-Zionism, which is, many times varying into anti-Semitism.
I'm curious what you think will be the impact on Jewish identity of this renewed appreciation of the dangers of anti-Semitism, perhaps renewed resources being devoted to it. It picks up on something I think Yehuda was asking a while before. We've spent a lot of time trying to focus our communities and particularly our young people's attention on the desirability, as I think you put it at the end of your book, of becoming Jews and what really motivates us to be Jewish. And I'm just wondering what you think will be the consequence as this is addressed in the ways that you suggested.
Do one more? You want to do one more? Yeah. Go behind you.
Hi. I guess my question is, and I think I have to say it, otherwise I wouldn't be honest enough. I have to give the context to it. So my name is Abby Stein. I'm with one of the 3 Jews on, maybe call them token Jews, whatever you want, on the Women's March Steering Committee this year, on the National Women's March. And I guess my question is, and I obviously came to a conclusion on my own before, but what do you think is the boundary between there's a problem, and as you said, there's problems on both sides, but what is the boundary of this is a group of people we cannot work with anymore, it's a waste of time, versus when do we know, okay, this is terrible, but can we still work with that? What would be your approach to answering that?
Great question. Okay, intersectionality. Intersectionality, for those of you who don't know, in its origins, grew out of a lawsuit, in part, brought by a group of African American women who worked, I believe it was in the GM plant in the Michigan area. And they brought a lawsuit saying that they couldn't get good jobs on the assembly line, which are the high-paying jobs, because they were women. And they couldn't get jobs in the front office as secretaries and administrators because they were black. That they were facing a double they're two minority statuses, or were intersecting and preventing them. And in that sense, I think it's a good concept. It does give us shades of understanding prejudice, which are much more nuanced. But today, I think intersectionality has come to be used in a way that often gives a home and comfort to anti-Semitism, certainly to a contempt for, not a criticism of, but a contempt for Israel that uses these anti-Semitic tropes and memes, et cetera, so that today you have this weird situation where LGBTQ groups on campus have linked themselves with BDS movement because we're against the oppression of all people. And, where would you rather be someone who is LGBTQ, whatever your identity may be, in Tel Aviv or in Amman, much less Cairo or someplace else? So I think in the way it's understood today, that nuance of the decent idea that it was in the very beginning has been lost. I'm going to come back to the Jewish identity one at the end. In terms of the Women's March, as you obviously know, I came out strongly against participating in the Women's March. The Women's March was marching for an issue that is of utmost importance. Team USA put that back in the spotlight 2 nights ago. I mean, the nicest article I read is that little boys are wearing shirts with the names of the players on them. You have to buy those. But clearly, there's a real problem. There's a problem of unequal pay. There's a problem of sexual harassment. There are many, many problems. The breaking point for me came over the refusal to recognize and acknowledge the anti-Semitism, not just of Minister Farrakhan, but of others as well. And possibly I could have joined hands if we all lived on the same block and we were fighting for, as I said to a group earlier this week, we were fighting for a traffic light because kids were being hit, or a bicycle path because bicyclists were being killed or something like that by their collision with traffic. But to march behind people who are supposedly fighting prejudice and fighting discrimination when they themselves have refused to recognize it, refused to acknowledge it, and in certain cases have given it comfort and engaged in it, I just couldn't do. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I agree with you. And one of the kind of requirements that we put down was that for us to be able to say how to do that. And I'm not arguing that it's very powerful, obviously was, but the point for me was that after we did it together, they did announce boards, they did announce adding anti-Semitism to their platform, and so on. Not everything that we asked for was up, but a lot of it we did get. So for me, it got to a point where it was, okay, great, they're voices. My question wasn't specifically to the women's march, but in general, how do we know if we're being literate? When do we know that it's over, that they're not going to listen to us? As opposed to, let's talk to you and see if they actually do. It's a whole big thing.
Okay, we could get into the weeds of what happened there, and I respect you for trying there. I obviously would have done something different, but that's all right. That makes for books and conversation and good exchanges and lively Shabbat meals. But I think sometimes you're right. Sometimes we get so stuck in where we are that we can't move forward. And sometimes it's ad kan v'lo ya'avor, to this point and no further. And I really felt that was what happened here. And the fact that just 2 days ago, Linda Sarsour, again said that it's not a new thing, it's been said before, but because she said it, it got a lot of attention, that Jesus was a Palestinian Jew, a term which didn't exist except maybe in the Tanakh, which didn't quite exist at that point anyway, but is just look, as I tweeted, I said, when I find myself agreeing with Yair Netanyahu, something's very wrong, in terms of Jewish identity, I don't know where that over here. Jewish identity. I spoke a lot about this yesterday with a group of the rabbis. So with those of you present, I apologize for reiterating it, but I think it's really the crucial point. When, as I said earlier, when I go out now to speak to non-Jewish audiences, I feel like, and usually I say the same thing to all audiences because I'm reminded of what President Harry Truman said: if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember what you told to whom, But nonetheless, my challenge is, I feel, to get non-Jews to take anti-Semitism seriously and not to think of us as a bunch of neurotic, people. We may be a neurotic people, but this is a real problem, When I go to speak to Jewish audiences, it's almost like a chameleon, a Rashomon, in that I want people to take it seriously, but I don't want to say not to take it too seriously, but not to let it become the determining factor of their Jewish identity. If we first of all, if you say it's anti-Semitism that drives me, anti-Semitism makes me feel more Jewish, and there was just an article about that where a woman said, the anti-Semitism in the Labor Party made me feel more strongly Jewish. I didn't jump down her throat. It made me sad. It made me sad because she had ceded to the oppressor power over her identity. So that if the anti-Semite isn't there, well, it doesn't matter. A. B, if you let it be anti-Semitism that drives you, what you have then is Jew as object. What becomes important is what is done to Jews, as opposed to Jew as subject, what Jews do. And again, I mentioned to some people yesterday, there was, long ago, when I think there was one road from Tel Aviv to Haifa, the shore road, around the area of Herzliya, there used to be a hull of a ship from Aliyah Bet, you know, the illegal ships, and it was called the Afal Pi. And it was the Afal Pi or the Afal Pi Chain. I don't know whether how much room they had on the side of the ship, or paint, or time to paint it, or whatever. But the nonetheless, obviously from Afal Pi Sheyit Mamea, even though the Mashiach may tarry, Elijah may tarry, nonetheless, I believe. That's what it should be. It shouldn't be because of anti-Semitism. It should be despite. And, fear is the great equalizer. I'm not being the least bit critical here not in the least, of Jews who are motivated by anti-Semitism. Fear is the great equalizer. The Nazis didn't ask, do you know Talmud, do you know Gemara, and we're going to persecute you more, or do you know an Aleph from a bet? I mean, there were churches in the Warsaw Ghetto, because there were Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto who considered themselves Christians. But fear is the great equalizer. Fear will often bring people out of the woodwork, or out of the closet, to borrow a euphemism from another form of persecution. The challenge we have is to keep them there for the positive. It's not unlike, I think, many people certainly in the Tfutzot, in the diaspora, and their connection with Israel. I know many people whose connection with Israel is made stronger. Israel is beleaguered, Israel is attacked, Israel is unfairly criticized, all of which is true. But I would feel my connection is, I get disturbed by those things, but that's not why I love being here, and I love coming here and want to spend as much time as I can here. It's because of the positive, the pull. So we have that challenge. I mentioned this to Yehuda earlier, that there are two essays I mentioned towards the end of the book. One is by Selah Whittemire Baron, who was the first person to have a chair in Jewish history at Columbia, not the first person at Columbia, but the first chair in Jewish history in the United States. And Baron was a master of Jewish history. He was the historian who testified at the Eichmann trial when they needed a historian, and Ben Gurion didn't like any of the people at the Hebrew University, so they brought someone from Columbia. But it was more complicated than that. But in any case, Baron wrote in the 30s about the lachrymose concept, right? Lachrymose concept of Jewish history, the tearful concept, that many people, Baron was primarily he knew the sweep of Jewish history, but medieval period was his great strength. That many people, many Jews, have a perception of the Middle Ages of pogrom to persecution to expulsion, pogrom to persecution, and they lose sight of the great intellectual achievements, the great halachic achievements, the great cultural achievements, communal achievements. In the United States, our federation system is built on a system that evolved in the Middle Ages in Europe. Or the other essay is Shimon Ravidovich's Israel, the Ever-Dying People, that we always think, each generation thinks it's the end. Rambam writes to a group of rabbis in southern France, you are the end, nobody cares about Torah, nobody worries about Torah, etc., etc. The Zionist poets, who will read my poetry, etc. So, but Ravidovich says that's a sort of coping mechanism, that if you're prepared for the worst, you're never surprised by it. But I call the last chapter of the book "Oi versus Joy," and I would much rather have the motivating factor for identity be a joyous thing than an oi thing. But that's hard. That's hard. What I like to say is, sometimes I think I'm optimistic. Of course, a Jewish optimist is someone who thinks things can't get any worse. A Jewish pessimist thinks they can, and a Jewish realist knows they are, you know. But it's sometimes I think we have to fight the pessimism, even at the same time that we recognize that it's valid.
Deborah, you know, one of the ideas on which this institute was built is an essay of David Hartman's in the early 80s called Auschwitz or Sinai. At the time, David of blessed memory was trying to push against what you're describing, which is that when an Auschwitz consciousness becomes the defining variable by which a society governs its moral intuition, it can't help but legitimate its constant victimhood. Its fears are never falsifiable, and it never holds itself up to the full accountability of what the Sinai Covenant asks of us. It's interesting, near the end of his life, David Hartman gathered a group of his students and was talking about some of his regrets, some of his some of the things he felt he missed. And one of the things he acknowledged in that conversation was, in the effort to suppress the hegemony of the Auschwitz victimhood story, maybe he didn't take it fully seriously. In other words, that some sense of vigilance, some sense of b'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chalotenu as actually an ontological characteristic of the Jewish condition is something that has to be factored in, even if I decide, nevertheless, that I'm going to still organize my Jewish identity not around victimhood but around covenant. So I feel that your work, both putting this in front of us, holding a mirror to us to the Jewish people and to the world about the challenges that we face with anti-Semitism, and yet the desire to remind us that we are ultimately, that if you actually believe in the covenant, you can't believe that they're ever going to be able to destroy you. That reminder of this consciousness and at the same time a belief of Sinai, I want to thank you for making a tikkun for this institution and to thank you for your work and for your comments here tonight.
Thank you very much.